Okay, this is the presentation on Reiman's Folly of Capital Punishment. Since it is largely response to the best bet argument that Podgman presented in his paper, you can look at this as a counter-argument to Podgman, but you can also look back at the things Podgman had to say for some potential counter-arguments against this piece. It is up to you to try to honestly weigh the evidence. That said, let's move on. It is important to know how this paper relates to the Pro paper on the death penalty. Reiman's paper is aimed at Van den Haag's common sense arguments used to support his best bet argument. Since Podgman's piece specifically uses Van den Haag's reasoning, it works as response to his piece as well. Reiman's main line of argument is going to be to criticize the common sense arguments in favor of the death penalty. This is important in relationship to Podgman's paper. If you remember, the common sense reasons to support the death penalty were the only reason to use the death penalty over other methods that do not have statistical evidence that they work to deter murders, but which do not kill the criminal, such as tickling feet, writing sentences on a chalkboard, and so forth. Reiman gives three major reasons to doubt that the death penalty deters violent crimes like murders. He gives two quick reasons and then spends a good portion of the rest of the paper expanding on the third reason. His third reason, that not executing sends a moral message, implies that the death penalty might even increase violent crime rates and that not using it might reduce them. If this were the case, then the innocence in the best bet calculation might be saved by not having the death penalty instead of by having it. Reiman points out that common sense is commonly wrong. Common sense is what tells us that the earth is flat. After all, it looks that way. Common sense is what tells us that heavier objects should fall faster than lighter ones. After all, it seems like they should. They pull down harder. Common sense tells us that the sun goes around the earth and that objects such as your desk are solid matter. But when we investigate, we find out that the earth is roundish, all objects fall at the same speed, disregarding wind resistance, the earth goes around the sun, and that the atoms that make up your desk and everything else are almost entirely empty space. When it comes to the physical sciences, common sense is very often wrong, perhaps much more often than it is right. It is even worse when it comes to psychology. One particularly interesting example of this is known as the bystander effect. This is the name given to the fact that when a few people witness a crime or a person in need of assistance, they are more likely to call for help than when very many people are present. Common sense would say that the more people there are around, the more likely it is somebody would call for help. But it turns out that the reverse is the case. Nevertheless, when people are asked why they didn't call for help, they will swear up and down that the number of people around them had nothing to do with their decision. Yet in test after test, the number of people is the only variable being changed. This seems to show not only that common sense is often wrong, but that we can be wrong about our own motivations. Now that common sense has been knocked off its pedestal, Reiman gives us three reasons to doubt that the death penalty deters murders. First, that a more feared punishment will not deter more than a less feared one if the less feared one is already giving as much deterrence as possible. Second has to do with the number of guns in the US combined with how often criminals are shot by the police when committing crimes. And third is the idea that by not executing even people who deserve it, we send a powerful message that killing human beings is wrong and that this has a civilizing effect on humanity. Okay, so let's look at these one at a time. In regard to the first objection, Reiman points out that a more feared punishment will only deter more people than a less feared one if people are not already being deterred as much as they can be by the less feared one. The less feared punishment in this case would be life in prison without parole. This is a pretty awful prospect. Reiman's thought here is that even though being executed would be worse, nobody is going to think, well, I will at worst get life in prison without parole, so I think I will risk getting caught committing murder. Instead, the murderer is either likely not thinking about the consequences of her or his act, or does not believe she or he will be caught and so wouldn't be deterred by the death penalty either. In other words, life in prison without even the possibility of parole and execution are both life-ruining events. It is not as if one punishment were a fine and the other option was the death penalty. Given that both would utterly ruin somebody's life, both likely deter the same amount. Reiman's second reason for why we should doubt that the death penalty deters more murderers than life without possibility of parole is the sheer number of households with guns in the U.S. Numbers vary, but a quick search on PollingReport.com for numbers in 2011 showed that 44% of U.S. households have guns. These numbers are a bit controversial. Some think that they are low because many gun owners are concerned about people knowing about their guns. Likely there are also some false positive reports as well, with some claiming ownership for the same reason that one might have a beware of dog sign even though they do not have a dog. But there is general agreement that the number is pretty high, somewhere between 35 and 50%. Additionally, according to the best figures I can find, 373 criminals are justifiably killed just by the police each year. This was the best average I could find, and it was between 1984 and 1998. As I said, these numbers are very hard to get. These numbers are hard to get, and they might well be higher because the police do not like to report on the number of civilians shot, and these numbers are not compiled accurately at a federal level. But we know that the number of people executed in the year 2000 was 85. So, what do these numbers have to do with anything? Reiman's point is that if criminals are not deterred by the much more immediate and much more likely death they risk while committing the crime, why would they be deterred by the much more distant and much less likely prospect of receiving the death penalty further down the road and after a trial? It would be like somebody who eats out of a dumpster being afraid of using a dirty fork. The point that Reiman spends the most time with is the argument that by not killing criminals, even those who might deserve to die, we are sending a powerful message that killing human beings is not acceptable. It is the retributist view, lex talionis, that is often summed up as an eye for an eye. This view usually endorses capital punishment for murder. But Reiman points out that there are many things that even staunch retributivists think are just too evil to do to criminals who have done the same thing. For example, we don't beat assaulters, we don't rape rapists, we don't torture torturers. As a society, we think that these things are wrong to do, even to somebody who might deserve the same treatment that she or he has been giving others. This last bit is important. We might think that the person in some sense deserves these bad things. We might not feel sorry for such a person if something bad happened to them, such as if we see a bully get bullied himself or herself in a movie. Many people think that the person in some sense deserves this. But believing that the person deserves it, and that it is okay for us to do that kind of thing to another human being, are two different things. We might not feel sorry for an assaulter who himself or herself gets assaulted, but we do not typically think that it is okay to beat them. Many people may not feel sorry for a rapist who ends up getting raped, but that does not mean that we think that the state should pay people to rape rapists, or that this is ever the type of thing that it is okay to endorse doing to another human being. Reiman believes that killing should be added to that list of things that are just too terrible to do to other human beings. To try to make this point stick, Reiman points out several features of the death penalty that make it especially horrible. The pain of the penalty itself, the psychological pain of being on death row and awaiting death. This includes hoping for appeals, being in a perpetual state of fight or flight, having those hopes dashed, and so forth. He also thinks that the spectacle of the death penalty makes it especially horrible. It is worth noting, though Reiman doesn't mention it in his paper, that most forms of capital punishment are thought to be quite painful. Often lethal injection is mentioned as a painless version of the death penalty, but it turns out that this is often not the case. Lethal injection works by giving the person to be executed 3 drugs. One makes the person unconscious, the other paralyzes her or his body so that people don't see the thrashing, and the third stops the heart. The problem is that recent investigations have shown that often too little of the drug meant to make the person unconscious is given, and that it is likely that many people have been conscious throughout the experience but could not show it because the paralytic drug prevents them from moving. Oftentimes the standards for lethal injection do not meet the minimum standards required for putting pets to sleep. The progress of civilization. By adding killing to the list of things that we say is too horrible to do to our fellow human beings, Reiman believes that we will be continuing the process of civilizing society. He paints a picture in which, as human rights have increased, and as government power has decentralized, punishments have become less and less harsh physically. Putting people in stocks and beatings used to be common punishments for crimes. The death penalty used to be given for cases of theft. But Reiman argues, as we become more civilized, our punishments have become less draconian. It is also worth noting that, at least correlated with less violent punishments, violent crime has been consistently going down throughout history. Often people mistakenly think that it is on the rise. This is likely due to more sensationalized news, more news networks, and a greater willingness on the part of the news media to report these crimes. I will pause for a 5 count so that you can pause the presentation to study this graph. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Finally, Reiman points out that if you look at countries that still have harsh corporal punishments, they tend to be countries that are despotic rather than democratic in nature with centralized authority. They are also usually less developed technically and economically. Most major Western democratic nations, however, have done away with corporal punishments, including the death penalty. Reiman believes that reducing the severity of punishment would only be a loss if it somehow made life more dangerous. But given his arguments that the death penalty does not deter crime, he does not think that removing it does. And that is the end of this presentation. Until next time.